Welcome back to Face the Nation. I'm Margaret Brennan. We turn now to Mark Short, White House Director of Legislative Affairs, to get the administration's perspective on all that is going on in Washington. Mark, you're a busy man. Let's start on the nominations question. Republicans really can't afford to lose a single vote. You just heard Senator Rand Paul saying he opposes both the nominee to be CIA and the Secretary of State. How do you get enough votes to get your guys through?
Well, we think we have two incredibly qualified candidates there. Mike Pompeo, as you know, graduated top of his class at West Point, graduated top of his class at Harvard Law School, served our country with distinction in uniform, served our country in distinction in Congress. He's done a phenomenal job at restoring morale at the CIA. We think he's a phenomenal choice. He earned 15 Democrat votes in his confirmation only a year ago.
You're going to need some of those Democrats this time, too.
Well, I think it's unfortunate where Rand Paul's position is, and before the hearings begin and getting some of the answers to his questions. I think that Rand himself ran for president on a policy that was kind of to put your head in the sand about North Korea and Iran and just hope they don't develop nuclear weapons. That's out of sync with the rest of the American people, which is why they went a different direction. But we think there's enough Democrats who'll help support our candidates, and I think with Gina Haspel, as you mentioned in your previous interview, 33 years of service in the CIA, station chief in multiple of the most dangerous places in the globe, somebody who has earned the support not just of Republican people who run the CIA, but also Democrat heads, people like Leon Panetta, people like Brennan, people like Clapper, not even though not at the CIA, but in the intelligence community. So she has broad bipartisan support. We think she'll earn the support of many Democrats in her confirmation hearing, too.
Will the president agree to allow the CIA to publicly release information, the details of her background that Rand Paul and Angus King say they want to hear more about?
I'm sure that we're going to look to provide as much information as necessary without compromising any international secrets. So we're going to want to be cooperative, but again, I think that we have two incredibly qualified candidates. The president's very excited that he's nominated them, and that looks forward to putting them in office as soon as possible. And Margaret, as we face negotiations with North Korea, it's all the more important that this happen expeditiously. It's important that members come together and make sure these confirmations happen quickly in the next coming weeks.
But this was a decision the president made, and you're saying you need a Secretary of State. Well, he had one until he fired him.
Well, that's true, Margaret, but I think that the reality is that these are negotiations that are now beginning. It's important the president be on the same page with the Secretary of State, who he works with and agrees with on many fronts. And so we think that Congress should work quickly. We're very frustrated at the pace of Congress in many nominations. As you and I have discussed off camera, the reality is that so far the number of filibusters on our nominees is 4 times greater in 1 year than the last 4 presidents combined in their entire first terms. It's really reached an historic obstruction.
And behind on nominations, too. But I want to ask you about the place you work every day. Senator Jeff Flake said Republicans should come out against the president if he starts attacking Robert Mueller, that is a red line. The president's had a lot to say about the special counsel this morning. Are you hearing outcry from Republicans?
I've not heard a lot of outcry from Republicans, and all due respect to Jeff Flake, I'm not sure as far as him representing the Republican Party couldn't get reelected in his own state today. So the reality is,
you think Republicans are okay with the kind of messages the president is sending this morning?
I don't think that the president or anybody right now in our White House is suggesting not cooperating in any way with the Mueller investigation. We've cooperated in every single way. Naturally,
the president's attorney called for an end to
everyone in the White House has cooperated on this, and what I said is that we have cooperated in every single way, every single paper they've asked for, every single interview. And I think the reality, Margaret, is that yes, there's a growing frustration that after more than a year and millions of dollars spent on this, there remains no evidence of collusion with Russia.
The investigation's ongoing.
Of course it is. It's ongoing over a year, and it's been ongoing also in both the House and the Senate doing their own independent investigations where the House has concluded there was no collusion. I think at some point the American people are owed an answer to say, okay, if there was no collusion, how much longer will this drag on?
Well, that is why the Justice Department put that special counsel in place, saying that the American people deserve an answer to that question of what Russia's influence was. So in these public statements, isn't the president appearing to discredit or attempt to discredit the outcome of that?
I think the president's expressing his frustration, which I think is well warranted and merited. As I said, there has been no evidence whatsoever of collusion. There's been millions and millions of dollars spent at taxpayer expense trying to uncover this. And the reality is that there's two separate issues here. One is Russia interference, Margaret. And if you look at Russia interference, this administration has imposed sanctions. This administration has helped to arm Ukraine with defensive weapons to protect it against Russian aggression. This administration partnered with NATO condemning the most recent murders in Britain by Russia.
Right. The president hasn't tweeted about those things today,
the previous
which is why
administration,
we didn't ask you about Ukraine.
Well, the previous Obama administration did absolutely nothing as far as combating interference in the elections. So this administration has taken action. As it relates to collusion, there is none.
How's morale at the White House? We know the Chief of Staff held a meeting this week to reassure people.
Morale on our team is great, Margaret. I think the reality is
the legislative team.
Where I think the reality is what the American people want to know is, despite the media's coverage of who's up, who's down, what's the latest palace intrigue.
The Secretary of State was fired this week.
They want to know what the latest palace intrigue.
That's not the media.
What the American people want to know is, what is unemployment rate? It's the lowest in 17 years. How are jobs doing? Lowest unemployment rate for Hispanic Americans in history. Lowest for African Americans in history. You see an economy that's growing again.
You're confident that the staffers you're working with who come to work every day feel that their jobs are safe? I mean, why did the Chief of Staff have to have that meeting?
Anytime in this environment, there's always going to be a lot of turmoil, Margaret. That's something you sign up for. You recognize you serve at the pleasure of the president. We sign up knowing that we're trying to do the will of the American people. And as you look at the records of this administration and what the American people are pleased at with the way the economy is growing and the way that they're being protected, ISIS having lost 99% of the territory it contained prior to this administration, we're making America safer. The economy is booming. 4.5 million Americans have either received a wage increase or a bonus since tax plan came into effect. The economy, where we are as a country, the consumer sentiment reached a 20-year high just this week.
All right. Well, Mark, you got a lot of work to do this week. Thank you very much for making time to come on the show. We'll be right back. It's been 10 days since President Trump accepted North Korean leader Kim Jong-un's invitation to meet, but there's still been no public response from North Korea. Yesterday, I spoke with South Korean Foreign Minister Kang Kyung-hwa, who's in town for talks on trade and North Korea. That's where our conversation began. Have you heard anything from North Korea in response?
Well, nothing publicly, but there is a channel of communication now established. So I'm sure there are back and forth messages. But I think the North Korean leader would also need some time, given the readiness with which President Trump has accepted the invitation to talks. I think we were all quite surprised by the readiness of that decision. I think it was an extremely courageous decision on the part of President Trump. We believe the North Korean leader is now taking stock. We give them the benefit of the doubt and the time that he would need to come out with some public messaging.
So you were surprised President Trump accepted so quickly. Do you think Kim Jong-un was surprised?
I think we all were.
Your President Moon has plans already to meet with Kim Jong-un next month. What does South Korea hope to achieve from that conversation?
This is, of course, also a very historic engagement. And the North Korean leader is coming just south of the DMZ for the third Inter-Korean summit. The two previous ones were held in Pyongyang, the North Korean capital. So the indication that he is willing to come south for this is very significant in itself.
In the talks between North and South Korea, will the nuclear program even be a topic, or are you saving that for President Trump?
No, we're not saving that for, I think, President Trump. I think this is a concern not just for the United States, but for South Korea as well. But I think we will want to discuss key security issues, including the denuclearization issue.
What conditions do the North Koreans have to meet before this conversation happens?
Well, in effect, they already have. We have asked the North to indicate in clear terms the commitment to denuclearization, and he has, in fact, conveyed that commitment.
He's given his word.
He's given his word, but the significance of his word is quite weighty in the sense that this is the first time that the words came directly from the North Korean Supreme Leader himself, and that has never been done before.
The idea of a North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un, meeting with an American president caught a lot of people by surprise. What is the significance of that to South Korea?
Well, it clearly demonstrates the President Trump's will, determination to resolve this issue once and for all. And I think that's hugely appreciated by the South Korean public. The previous years before the administration has been one of non-action, called strategic patience. What has changed is the maximum pressure campaign, which is a series of Security Council sanctions, but also U.S. unilateral sanctions. North Korea is in a situation of very limited ability to engage economically with the outside world, which means it has very limited ways of improving the livelihood of the people.
You're describing a weak North Korea financially.
Economically, definitely.
But they've never been this militarily strong when it comes to the development of their nuclear program. They've never come this close to being able to hit the U.S. mainland with a weapon before. So they're actually walking into these talks in a strong position in some ways.
But I think that's probably what goes into the North Korean calculation of coming out to dialogue at this point. But again, its strength on the side of its nuclear missiles program, but on the side of the economy, very, very weak and increasingly so. The art of diplomacy and negotiation is what this boils down to.
What is South Korea and what is the U.S., its partner, willing to offer North Korea at this negotiation?
At this point, we haven't offered it anything. We had made it clear that we will engage, but there will be no reward for dialogue.
Does South Korea trust Kim Jong-un?
As I said, it's not a matter of trusting. It's a matter of discussing and pressing for action. And once you see those actions, then you move forward further.
When President Trump says things like he did reportedly at this political event earlier this week when he suggested U.S. troops could be removed because of a trade dispute, how are those comments received in South Korea?
Well, anytime troops are mentioned, it raises eyebrows. So yes, it has caught attention, but we are absolutely confident of the American commitment to the alliance and the troop presence in our country.
So you don't take comments like that seriously?
Well, we take any comment coming from the president very seriously, but in the larger scheme of things, is this alliance that have been the bedrock of peace and security on the Korean Peninsula, but also the Northeast Asia for decades.
Next week, those tariffs on steel and aluminum go into effect. What's going to happen to South Korea?
Well, we've been arguing very much, as ally, and particularly a visible alliance at this point when we are trying to make the most of this opportunity that is created to come to terms with the North Korean nuclear issue, that we need an exemption on this. So we've put all of our arguments and considerations on the table, and we're hoping for a good result.
No assurances that you will be exempt yet?
I think we'll know when the decision is made and announced, but I think we're putting the best arguments in place.
This comes in the middle of what was already a tough renegotiation of that U.S. free trade deal with South Korea. So are you concerned that some of this beating up on trade is going to hurt the alliance?
There has always been trade issues. The steel issue is not entirely new. This is particularly big. But we take it for what it is and try to deal with it. But again, yes, coming at this particular time, it's not helpful.
Minister, thank you.
Thank you.
You can see our full interview with Minister Kang on our website, facethenation.com. We'll be back in a moment with our political panel. And now for some political analysis. Dan Balls is chief correspondent at The Washington Post. Susan Davis is a congressional correspondent for NPR. And Mark Landlerd is a White House correspondent at The New York Times. Dan, we've been talking a lot about the hirings and firings at the White House this week. you saw late Friday, Attorney General Jeff Sessions fire the Deputy Director of the FBI, Andrew McCabe. Some are saying this will win him a few political points. What do you make of this?
Well, I think that's probably right. He'll gain some points with the person he needs to gain those most with, and that's the President of the United States, who very much wanted to see McCabe go and had been tweeting for a long time and making statements that I think put the Attorney General in a position where he had to act and had to fire him. And we have seen since that firing, the President of the United States come back in and ratify that and push harder on that. So I think that what we saw was the intimidation coming from the President of the United States. Again, we haven't seen the report, the IG report that lays out the rationale for the firing, and I think everybody is right in saying we have to see that before we can draw full conclusions. But there clearly was pressure coming from above on the Attorney General on this. He was not acting simply as an independent agent.
And we know that because the president sent a tweet at one point specifically pointing out that McCabe was going to retire for full benefits, and this firing came hours before that would have been possible.
Right, and you know, we've seen a number of people say, regardless of the merits of the case, the notion that this was rushed in a way as to be punitive and mean-spirited is part of the issue that we now have. And following that, John Dowd's statement yesterday that this would be a good time for Mueller to close down the investigation, initially suggesting he was speaking for the president, then walking that back, again raises this question of the pressure that is being put on the Justice Department and on the special counsel.
Susan, you're already hearing from Jeff Flake. In the past, you've heard from Senator Graham say, don't go near Bob Mueller. That's a red line here. Is that for show? I mean, Mark Short from the White House was saying they haven't heard that kind of outcry from congressional Republicans.
You know, what we have heard from congressional leaders like the Speaker and the Majority Leader in the Senate is that they have confidence in Mueller's investigation, that they don't support any effort to interfere with the investigation. I do think that the interpretation of the president's reaction to the McCabe firing does seem like there is an acceleration of his frustration towards Mueller. I don't know what happens if the president really does try to close down this investigation or go further with firings at the Justice Department. Congress has really been, under Republicans, quiet largely about how the president has handled this. They have not been very confrontational with him. It has been described as a red line. I do think that's fair. I do think Senator Angus King, who you heard earlier in the program, say something along those lines would be like a constitutional crisis. And I think he's accurate in that. I think it's a concern, though, that Republicans at this stage continue to keep private. We did not see much of a reaction coming from Capitol Hill, either about the firing of McCabe or his comments about the Mueller investigation. But the concern is real.
You did have a few comments saying the Judiciary Committee is going to be looking into exactly what happened.
The question here, too, and as Dan said, we don't know a lot about the substance, right? We haven't seen the IG report, but I do think there's a lot of members of Congress that look at this and do raise questions about the timing. Mm-hmm. And why didn't they make a better case to the public? If the substance is there, if Andrew McCabe did deserve to be fired, if the facts are on your side, then let the facts play out and let the public be on your side. And so the way it was handled, I do think there is some frustration. Congress has not been very aggressive in its oversight of this administration. This might be something they just simply can't ignore.
Mark, the president already had quite a week of news after firing his Secretary of State, leading to these reports of chaos, upheaval, more changes to come. What is happening? What is motivating this kind of communication from him today?
Well, I mean, the president's talked recently about how he's actually getting closer to having the cabinet that he wants in place. And, you know, there's a school of thought that says
he picked the first cabinet.
He picked the first cabinet, but to be fair, he picked some people he didn't know well, people who were recommended to him by outsiders. Rex Tillerson is a good example of that. Mm-hmm. And now after 14 months, I think he's coming into his own, and I think he's decided he wants to have people around him who agree with him, who see the world the way he does, who don't push back. One thing about Rex Tillerson is he pushed back on the Iran deal, for example. Mike Pompeo, by all accounts, won't do that. Tillerson was very forward-leaning on diplomacy with North Korea at a time when the president wasn't. Pompeo would be much more inclined to line up with the president. And so I think that we're seeing the president, in some sense, coming toward having the type of people around him that he's most comfortable with. And then you also have to say, this is a guy who does operate by having a chaotic environment around him, the type of chaos that many people would find untenable. President Trump is comfortable with. He always has been in his business career, and he is now as president.
It was interesting to me to hear Senator Corker in our interview basically say, yeah, the Iran deal most likely is dead in May. As you bring up, Mike Pompeo, the nominee to be Secretary of State, has been a vocal critic of that deal. I mean, what do we extrapolate from some of these changes the president is making to his cabinet?
Well, the Iran deal is an interesting test case because you've got several people on the national security team who have argued strenuously that the president not rip it up.
H.R. McMaster.
H.R. McMaster, Jim Mattis, the defense secretary, and the former secretary of state. With Pompeo in place, you'll now have one less voice making that case. And also, to be sure, the president has gotten more and more impatient each time he's had to make this decision. And so I think Senator Corker is reflecting reality, which is we're at the end of the line for this deal. And without Tillerson's voice there to defend it, the likelihood is much higher he goes ahead and rips it up.
Dan, also this week, you had the president saying that this defeat of Republicans in this Pennsylvania special election wasn't really a defeat. It was in some ways a referendum of Trumpism. Is that how you read Conor Lamb's victory?
Not exactly. I mean, if you want a good example of a great attempt at spin, that was the argument that in one way or another, Conor Lamb became the new congressman from that district because he was very Trumpian. No, I think quite the opposite. I think this was, as we have said many times, this was a district that went 20% margin for Donald Trump. But it also went 17 points in favor of Mitt Romney in 2012. This was not just a Trump district, this was a solid Republican district. And the fact that it moved as dramatically as it did is an indication that Republicans have stiff headwinds heading into the midterm election. Yes, Conor Lamb said some things that put him in a little bit better position in that district. He said he wouldn't vote for Nancy Pelosi as Democratic leader, for example. He talked about being in favor of the Second Amendment, but in many other ways he ran it on Democratic issues, and the turnout was very, very strong. And so I think we saw two things. One, that there were obviously some people who had voted for Donald Trump in 2016 who ended up voting for Conor Lamb. And the second, which we've seen again and again and again, is that the energy and the enthusiasm and the intensity is greater on the Democratic side at this point than it is on the Republican side.
Susan, do those stiff headwinds change the calculus of those in the Republican Party right now in terms of the willingness to challenge the president?
It is a very tricky thing for Republicans to do that, because the one thing that was true, and also in Pennsylvania was true, is Republican voters aren't angry at the president. They still like him. The question is, are they going to show up and vote for people down the ballot? And Democrats faced a similar problem under the Obama era, that Democratic voters still liked Barack Obama, but they didn't show up in the midterms to support him. One of the lessons of these midterm elections is that the president can hurt you, but he can't necessarily save you. And that I think Republicans, even though there was some very optimistic spin coming out of this race, are very aware of the fact that the House majority is very much in play. And that if they can't figure out a way to run in an environment where the president has an approval rating in the low 40s, that a lot of unexpected losses could be coming their way.
Susan, Dan, Mark, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you.
We'll be back in a moment. That's it for us today. Thanks for watching. Until next Sunday, for Face the Nation, I'm Margaret Brennan.